So, let's have a talk about logistics, shall we? Logistics. And as always, I have to be very kind and thankful to Naval History Net and, well, Gordon Smith, because they produce the absolute best maps in this scenario of where the bases are and where things are, and so I've used them shamelessly. I've credited them, cited them. I hope that if I've done this right, there's a link down below. If there isn't, please remind me and I'll make sure I put the link in to navalhistory.net. It's a great website. And, well, what are we going to be talking about? Am I going to be talking about actual ships? Am I going to be going into that level of detail of the equivalents of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary or whatever they had in terms of supply ships and how they were organized? No. Mainly because to do that would require a lot longer than I'm able to make time for with coughing and the fact that I move very soon. So I wanted to give you an overview of logistics and the logistics strategy and the reasons behind a logistics strategy. Because each nation is different. Each nation is interesting. Each nation is doing its own thing. And one of the first things I want to get you to go beyond is there is this conception that replenishment at sea starts in World War II. This is a picture of a system being used in 1903. Replenishment at sea, as I've discussed before in previous times, has been going on for a long time. It's how the British kept up blockades on the French coast during Napoleonic Wars. They sent out ships which were supply ships. So the ships only had to rotate back when they needed to come back for maintenance and when they needed to come back for repair. You could double or triple the time they were on station versus what they'd be if they were all rotating backwards and forwards themselves. And so you can maintain a far stronger squadron with less ships on station blockading the French harbours and the French ports and the Spanish harbours and Spanish ports. So that's what we're talking about. But the thing is, logistics has been moving on beyond that. But some of that logistics is still being built up because, if you think about it, you're dealing with transition. And we're transitioning not just from sail to coal, but coal to oil. And you still have some coal ships in service. You still have some early oil ships, some newer oil ships, and diesel ships. It's a far more complicated environment than it is necessarily today. You also have a scenario that everyone has slightly different needs and slightly different foundations to work from. So logistics is a national thing. If we are, talking about some nations, we're talking about what I would call a distributed logistics methodology, which is mainly there to support things like surface radar operations. However, if you're deploying major fleet or full fleet operations, your logistics capability is going to be very different. There is also the reality of what you're discussing, fast fleet oilers versus slower oilers. Well, honestly, both can be useful and both are often needed for different roles within a fleet structure. And then there's other supplies. Ammunition supplies, food supplies, what's often called dry goods. Dry store ships. So you have wet store ships, which are fuel, water, sometimes. Usually ships have the ability to make their own water, but some ships, let's be honest, their capacity for making water is not as high as their need for water, so you still supply water. And often as well, you might want to run water supply ships in areas in the world where it's going to be hotter. There's also other forms of supply. For example, the British liked to fit out ships which were mobile breweries. The Americans, mobile ice cream manufacturing plants. I won't tell you which ships had to be the most heavily guarded when they were in anywhere near an American base, But I will tell you that the Royal Marines ran a very good deal program whereby if you didn't try and board their ship, they were happy to swap alcohol for ice cream. If you tried to take over their ship, your alcohol supply was cut off. And you were back to drinking whatever your machinist mates could come up with in the engine room. Which, let's be honest, could taste fine, could taste terrible. Could be torpedo juice, which is pretty much dancing with death. So that's the reality we're talking about. Logistics in 1939 can basically be broken down from each nation by the situation they're in. And by what they've been looking at preparing for. There are also problems because it is often easier to sell on a government the idea of buying a massive, brand new, super duper battleship than it is the oiler you need to actually make it do anything. Just look at modern armed forces. Look at them all. Look at the amount of time you will hear someone complaining there is too much tail and not enough teeth in this armed force. And go, do you want them to project power globally? Yes. Then think about it as the tail has to start off in your country and the teeth have to be able to get to wherever they need in the world. So think about how much of a body you need to sustain that. And for every set of teeth you want there, think about how big the body's going to have to get to sustain that. Usually at that point, someone says, yes, but I want a great white shark of an armed forces. And you go, again, think about the teeth the shark has versus the size of the body. Okay, I know you might see cartoons where it's all teeth and a very small body, but sharks are not piranhas. Sharks are actually quite big logistical organisms to sustain the teeth, which then sustain the rest of the body. But that's an argument I end up having with people far too often. We'll leave that to one side. The point is, the logistics for each nation depends more often than not on how they view themselves, whether they view themselves as a regional power or a global power, what the realities of the regions they operate in are, and what the needs of that nation is. And also, especially true with at least one nation we're going to discuss, what they could actually generate and create in the time they had available prior to war. So, without much further ado, Shameless book plug. Now, the Shameless book plug, as you all know, comes in because in every single video I do a shameless plug of my book, because I'm a UK academic and the only way I can get promoted is by my book selling well, and this is the only one I currently have on the market. More are hopefully coming soon. But, and I say this as the glorious Glutamus Maximus of all Glutamus Maximuses, I don't only just do it because of that. I do it because I love sharing naval history. And I wrote that book in many ways as a primer for getting into naval history. It's got a lot of stuff explained in it, some of the stuff which is explained in different books all over the place, but it's pulled together so that you would have explanations of radar, then there would be explanations of fire control, etc. in one book, so it could be a starting point. Because I love books like that, and there aren't enough of them produced these days. There really aren't. Most of the books like that are older books, so that's why I like it. But I also use this section usually to say thank you to everyone for supporting the channel. Thank you especially, currently while I'm ill, for putting up with me having turned a lot of lives into premieres like I'm away on a trip with Shipshape again, because it allows me to record these over many hours, and packing up the house before moving and recording all this has probably not been sensible. But I've tried to record as many of these videos as possible before I go, so that you're covered until I'm settled. And when I'm settled in a new place, then from there I will hopefully be able to carry on my normal procedures and get back to you soon when I'm in better health. I'm hoping to have a new bed. I know I've brought this up a few times, and this might seem like a minor thing, but it's been wearing on my mind since when we were discussing the fact I was getting a new bed, was working out when exactly I last got a new one in here. And I don't know if anyone knows, comes under the logistics thing. You're supposed to replace your mattress every certain number of years. I have had the same bed and mattress apparently for 25 plus years. There is a reason they're wrecked. It survived my teenage years. I am forever grateful. It survived my bouncing on bed years, I think. Because I think it might be younger than my teenage years. It survived many, many dogs sleeping on it. It's a very good bed. The fact it's now finished and it will be going to the dump at some point, both brings me sadness and joy. It is about time for a new one. And the move and everything that's allowing me to get a new one, because I'm reorganizing all my books and everything, so I will actually have a room which has the space for a new bed, not a new one which is jacked up on books. It's all thanks to you, so thank you. Thank you for your support, and thank you for your help and kindness. So, the Germans. Let's start off with Germany and, well, its lack of logistics, full stop. So let's consider the Kriegsmarine and their logistical reality. To say they come third in the order of priorities of the German states when it comes to supplying material, and especially to resupplying material, is to be charitable. I'm fairly sure the German Girl Scouts equivalent came higher than the Navy at certain points in World War II, and certainly at certain points in terms of the priority of Goering's thinking. Hermann Goering was in charge of procurement industry for quite a long while, and had been in charge of it for quite a long while prior to World War II, and this explains a lot of the issues the German Navy has, especially when you then add on the polycratic nature of their government and the way they ran procurement. It just makes things a nightmare. This is one of the reasons why you level things like you can make the argument of inefficiency against the German Navy for having both anti-surface secondary guns and AA secondary guns. Because when you're in a scenario like they are, where they have the infrastructure and logistical realities they have, going down that route makes your situation worse. It truly does. In saying this, they have some innovative distributed logistics. Because whilst this might be their basing reality, they do supply things like the Graf Spee. They have Altmark and other supply ships out there supplying their surface raiders and even their submarines on occasion. And they do set that up with a very interesting system, which is actually very difficult for the Allies to focus in on, because they're just a merchant ship in the middle of the ocean. It's more problematic for them when they're dealing with ships in the North Atlantic. In the nicest way, in North Atlantic, if there's a ship on its own, it's kind of obvious that there is something weird going on, and very quickly something turns up to go, "Hello, are you in trouble?" The sort of "are you in trouble" where you know behind the smiles and the outreached hand is a gun hidden in the hand behind them sort of scenario. But when you're talking about the South Atlantic or Indian Ocean, yeah, those ships on their own, it's a case of, well, we haven't really got a full convoy system going on here, and there are other powers running ships through here, so we can't really justify searching every ship wandering around on its own. And, of course, life is made a lot easier once the Americans join the Allies as one of the other bigger merchant fleets, because then suddenly you know where the American ships are, or at least you can find out where the American ships are, and so you can cross those off your list, and so you're left with the South American ships, and the Turkish ships, and a few other things. But those, again, are running around are less and less, and not always so visible. That causes trouble for the German supply system, but the German supply system is set up, honestly, very innovatively. It's the supply system for the surface raiders at the beginning of the war is a system which hasn't been used in modern times. Similar systems had existed for supplying of frigates on distant stations, but mostly those in the Age of Sail, but mostly those had been a supply ship, usually a frigate, armed on flute, turning up and sitting in a port until the other frigate arrived. But of course, if you do that in a port which is visible, then everyone knows where you are, and the enemy tends to turn up. So you have to usually make it a port or a bay where there are less likely people watching you, and they have to know that you're going to be there in a certain period. Because again, Age of Sail, no one's got precise sailing times. They might be there on time, they might not be there on time, so you need to give a few days leeway. And that's pretty much what the Germans are doing. The Germans have a system whereby, if you know the day of the month, on the year, you know which sector that ship is likely, the supply ship is likely to be in, and you wander into that sector, and you try and find it in there. You know roughly where they're going to be, which grids where they're going to be. But realistically, the Germans have several major problems logistically. They don't have enough supplies stockpiled for a major war effort. Again, this was part of the Treaty of Versailles. They had lost a lot of their naval yard space, and they'd lost a lot of their supplies. Again, one of the advantages Britain, but also quite a lot of other powers have in World War II, is that they are running off a lot of World War I logistics. There's a lot of World War I era guns being fitted to the ships going out, Flower-class corvettes, etc. You don't need to produce guns. We've got a stockpile of them. Makes everything so much easier. When you've got a stockpile of guns and shells, you can just chunk onto merchant ships, you can just chuck on, you can adapt them out, you can do all those things, because you've got the guns ready to go. It really doesn't cause you any problem. It's a very different scenario for Germany. They're having to build everything from scratch, pretty much. And whilst they have got some supplies, I don't want to get people going with the idea of Dr. Clarke said they had no supplies. No, they have some supplies. They haven't had the time to build up enough. They just haven't had the time. You can't go, supplies appear. That just isn't what happens. You first of all have to decide what you're building. Then you have to build it. And you have to first build the stuff which is the components you need for working with it, and for it ongoing, and then you have to start building up a stockpile of surplus. And there just isn't the space in the German economy to truly build up a large surplus for the Navy, as well as for the Army and the Air Force. That's the criteria. Those are the important things. Especially to Hermann Goering. Who is the deputy fat boy, fun boy of World War II. Less improved edition. Definitely, even less improved edition. It's just terrible. So, Germany has issues. And realistically, this is why you can start to call them a regional navy. Because whilst they're able to project some power worldwide, it's very limited. The surface raiders are very quickly curtailed. The submarines can go a long way, and the interesting thing of them setting up submarines in the Indian Ocean is a truly amazing feat logistically. But those submarines are also constantly running on supply shortages. They are constantly short of spare parts. They're constantly short of personnel. They're constantly short of all the things they need. But realistically, yeah, they do a good job for what they have, for what they're dealing with. The level of operations they do sustain is pretty decent, and that's down to some of the preparations they've done prior to 1939. But the thing is, this is their logistic heart. This is its concentration. And as we go through nations, you're going to see it's going to expand. One of the really interesting things is with the sort of the whole timeline of World War II, is war taking place later actually does theoretically allow the expansion of the logistics basing and capabilities of a lot of the Axis powers if they choose to invest in that. And again, I have already commented about how difficult it is to get politicians in democratic countries to invest in the tail as well as the teeth. Try dictators who are obsessed with compensating for things. It's just the thing the German army needed most of the world: trucks. Lots and lots of trucks. The thing which Hitler and pretty much all his senior staff obsessed over were tanks. Tanks are great. They're wonderful. They are wonderful. But if you can't supply them, if you can't sustain them, they are useless. Tanks are only as good as their enablers. It can be the best tank in the world, but if you aren't able to sustain and enable it to operate, it's just a pillbox. A very expensive and complicated pillbox that sits above ground and is an easy target for artillery because it isn't sunken in the ground, doesn't have a lot of concrete around it. So that's a problem. That is truly a problem. And it's the same with warships and a fleet. You can have all the best teeth in the world, but if you can't sustain them, you're in trouble. This is one of the reasons why the milk cows, the converted U-boats to supply ships, are so important for operations by the German submarine arm, and why the British run a lot of risks with revealing that they cracked the Enigma in order to kill them. Because you disable one of those, you take one of those out, you have completely decimated the ability of an entire wolf pack to operate. That's a valuable asset and a valuable methodology. Then we are to the Italians. The Italians have a logistics is something which happens to other people approach in their higher command. Their navy is actually very, very smart in terms of when you're looking at captains and below. When you're looking at some of the officers above, well, it's a good job they're operating in the Mediterranean. Because honestly, they are structured around, you could argue, around fighting the French. But even then, they don't really have the logistical structure needed. Mussolini's main request when war was, well, when he was allying with Hitler, was that war shouldn't start before 1945, because he needed to get his house in order after Abyssinia. Abyssinia had literally drained the Italian logistics. Combined with the Spanish Civil War, they were running on fumes. And yes, they were managing to rebuild some stuff, but 1940 was too soon. 1940 was way too soon. They needed longer. They needed more. They needed time to build up more experience with their cruiser operations. They needed time to build up their supplies and the depth of supplies. The Italian Navy was like a trench, a defensive trench. It was a mile long. but only an inch deep and a couple of foot wide. It didn't have the depth of resources and supplies for it. When they did manage to shunt supplies in places, they could do great things. But that was when they had access to the supplies. Logistically, they are focused on the Mediterranean, but there's a reason the Royal Navy really doesn't bother about them in the extreme western or eastern Mediterranean. Because they very rarely venture that far, and certainly not in surface groups. And think about it. Sitting at the harbour entrance, or, well, not at the harbour entrance, at the entrance to the Mediterranean, is Gibraltar. And whilst, yes, there are 9.2-inch guns there are usually Nelson or Rodney hanging around, etc. Honestly, the Italian Navy should have been able to overwhelm it. It doesn't have a massive air support or anything, and the French, once they've been knocked out of the war, aren't any support for the British. So it's Gibraltar alone. You don't need to take Gibraltar, but surely you could pass it. But they don't. Because honestly, they don't have the logistics to do that operation. They don't even have the logistics to do a raid on it with heavy units. The Italians have a lot of potential in World War II. Their potential comes from their very high standard of the training, and from some very high quality designs and good capabilities built into those designs. They have a lot of problems because of the infrastructure and the logistical supply. They are not, I would argue, they have not been built, especially during Mussolini's time in power, on a strong enough basis to sustain war operations of the like they were going to be required to do, even to fight a war against the French. And that is a problem, because Mussolini had been in charge for an awful long time, and frankly, he'd been working with the same senior officers for an awful long time, and someone should have noticed. But honestly, they probably didn't want to argue back with Il Duce. As weak as he was as a dictator, he was still pretty darn mean and spiteful. And from the point of view of the Senate, where there are people critiquing him every day, the odds are the people in the Senate and in the wider government who knew the realities of the situation were kind of happy with it, because if their armed forces were all teeth and no tail, then he couldn't do much with them. He was constrained by the very realities he had created. So he got the teeth, he got the glory of having the teeth, but what could he really do with it? It's a good way of trying to avoid him getting them into a war, isn't it? Limit his ability to actually wage a war. And now we're into the Soviet Union. Soviet logistics in terms of naval operations can best be described as, well, they have ideas. They certainly have people who work very hard to try and make it a reality. And they certainly have a lot of, how do I put this politely? A lot of oeuvre for it. They really want to do it. The reality is, though, the Soviet Navy logistics is something which happens for other people. They try very hard at it, and they keep trying to organize things, but the purges especially hit the Navy hard, and they especially hit the naval officers who were at sea hard, because they were the ones who had the most experience of contacting and contact with outside people, so therefore the ones who were most at risk. And this meant that a lot of the officers who ended up being put in charge of things were the people who'd been at the back, being technical logistic officers. The trouble is, they have to make the transition without anyone there to without being able to train up their successors. And the trouble is, you therefore have a logistician who knows what the logistics is supposed to be done like, but are in charge of a ship, and they're not coordinating the logistics because they've got their ship to run. So they know what they should be signalling and ordering for, but the people on the other end have no understanding of what they're talking about or what they're asking for. So it's an incredibly interesting scenario in that you actually had in the 20s and 30s the development of a logistics organization going on which could have sustained some interesting fleet operations. It wouldn't have been the same as what the USN and the Royal Navy and the other navies, major navies could achieve, but it would have certainly been far more successful than they were at the beginning of World War II when they began their involvement. They have to relearn a lot of lessons, and mainly, as I said, that's because the people who actually had learned the lessons were no longer in the positions where they could utilize those lessons. And that might not sound a bad thing, because you're taking someone who's good at logistics, and they've got command experience, and you put them in command of a ship. Great. Who's now running the logistics section? That's the problem. So they try. They really do try. And as I said, they really have a lot of oeuvre, a lot of ideas, a lot of good thinking for it. But it really doesn't go well for them. They're trying though, and this is the thing. It's hard to rate because you look at some of the stuff they're building up in the 20s and 30s, and they're obviously building up to a, how do I put this? Within the freedoms that they are allowed by the Soviet system, they are building up a logistics system which allows for sustainment of fleet operations, especially in the Baltic and the Black Sea. They have more trouble with the Northern Fleet and the Pacific, but they are building them up. But then you have the purges, and you have all the officers move around, and the officers gone, and they're suddenly starting from scratch again. And the trouble is, some of the systems which they built up were now associated with some of those officers who've been purged. So if the officer who came up with it was bad, the system was obviously bad. So then they have to come up with ways of recreating those systems without them being obvious that they're recreating those systems. And the people trying to recreate those systems are the people who remember those systems, who are now no longer in a position to run the things, so they are having to almost recreate it by proxy, with someone who doesn't understand what they're saying. They're speaking the same language, but they don't understand each other. It's completely different dialects of naval operations. And that's their problem. So this is the scenario. When you give that discussion, there is always someone who goes, but they do this and this. They do, because that means when they do get it right, and they can sustain operations really quite well. But the trouble is they're having to rebuild it. So realistically, if they hadn't had quite such a dramatic purge and reorganization, who knows what they might have achieved. Okay, yes, they're still dealing with things like the Ganguts here. But the Ganguts should, in theory, require at least the maintenance of the Scharnhorsts, if not a Bismarck or Tirpitz in the Baltic, to deter them, if they're being used properly and if they're able to sustain properly. And that was the trouble for the Soviet Navy. They have a lot of, on paper, a lot of capabilities which they could use. But actually being able to marshal them requires the logistics for being able to put that logistics together. And when you combine it with the effects on their bases and the losses they sustain, yeah. They don't have the option. They don't have the ability to use it. Then we have the French. Now, the French here are interesting because, as you can see, they have pretty much the same bases they have today. But let's be honest, there are bases and there are bases. Some of these bases are well developed and organized, and some of these bases really are not. Some of them are places they can utilize. Some places they cannot. The French have done a lot of sustainment operations, and in 1920s and 30s have done some investment into their, what I would call, the Department of France forces and bases. But I would say the Department of North Africa has not had enough attention. And Martinique, Dakar, Djibouti, Beirut, Tahiti really haven't had enough attention. And Saigon, Haiphong, Shanghai and Canton definitely haven't had the attention they deserve. They've got forces there, and they are still playing lip service to it, but the trouble for them has been the changeover in governments. One government wants to do one thing, then they're gone in a few months, and another government wants to do another thing. And that's a problem. When you're changing ministers, that's bad enough with changing emphasis. When you're changing whole governments, that changes everything, because that changes the metrics they're working to. The metrics, of course, being what are the priorities of the government. It's hard enough for the British to get that sorted out, but for the French, it causes them continual problems. Combine that with the fact that they have issues getting their yards to standardise on parts. They're even still having issues in this period. They're sort of getting them sorted out, and they're sort of getting everything working towards being sorted out, but it's still difficult. And honestly, for the French, even more than the British, and, well, definitely more than the British, the Empire presents a problem for them, strategically. You see, the way the French have structured their empire, and well, they've got their empire, they don't have dominions. They don't have basically parts of the empire which are pretty much self-governing and almost, to an extent, self-defending, or at least having their own defense budget. Everything depends upon the French. Everything depends upon the French purse. So they have no sustainment in it that's outside of France. And that is an issue for them. Yes, they can have local, for want of a better phrase, militias. But they are not on the same level as the Indian Army, or definitely not the Australian Army or the Canadian Army. They're useful, don't get me wrong, and they're not. I don't want people going around going, you said they were cowards or they were bad. No, it's just that the French don't trust them enough to invest in them, or don't have the same situation in place. You know, one of the interesting things I often end up discussing is Indian independence, and when it happens, if you don't have World War II, and the answer to me is usually, well, it's in going through its independence process as you're talking about it at the bit prior to World War II. The British have a plan for independence of, or rather, they don't call it independence, they call it dominionization of the entire empire. Every part of the empire has a position on that program, and that's what they're working towards. Because the British don't like paying to run the empire. That's the thing. They don't want to be like the French, paying and having to run everything. The British prefer everything to be sort of running itself, but working in tandem with them. The idea of the Commonwealth is a dream for the British. They just like a Commonwealth which, honestly, had the Royal Navies kind of like the Royal Navy was in the 1920s and 30s, where all these different navies were basically part of one navy and basically almost operated as one navy, and the same with the army, and, you know, they basically maintained one foreign policy, but they had their own internal government, their own governments doing their internal policy. That's basically the British dream. Not really a sustainable dream, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that they could actually achieve that dream, but that's what they were hoping towards. And there are ways you could have achieved something approximate a dream, but it would not have been as British dominated as the British dreamed it would be. I think it would have been far more of a collective leadership, and it would be an interesting organisation to have seen come about, but that's a piece of history which we'll never see. Although, again, parts of it do exist. The Commonwealth is a good example of that. You know, the diplomatic nature of the Commonwealth, the way it coordinates with each other, the way, you know, the cultural ties and everything it promotes, they're all parts of it. Add into that a defence agreement and a common foreign policy, and you pretty much have the organisation the British were looking for. The British didn't want to be running everyone's internal affairs. They just wanted to make sure they left these nations in a way that they were running as democracies, because Britain felt democracies were far more stable long-term for them. And please note, democracy is the phrase here. The British were not necessarily considering copying the Westminster parliamentary system or anyone else's system. They felt like setting up a democracy which suited the nations they were involved in. Because, again, the British had realised, something which occasionally other empires don't realise, that if you set up a scenario where you rule by force, those places tend to become ruled by force after you leave, because it's a power vacuum. And the trouble is, dictatorships tend to be interesting. And the reason Britain had these places, taking these places, was because they had ports and resources which are of interest to the British economy and the wider empire economy. So you can't afford for that to be a scenario where they become a dictatorship which is unstable and you might lose access to that port and those resources. That's the reality. Someone, when I was describing this, said, oh, you're describing the British as a very altruistic empire. They're not being altruistic. It's entirely selfish. It's good for the fact that it's good for the local populace, that you would end up with a democratic situation, is entirely a byproduct that just the British are happy with. Then we've got America, and they're interesting because this is actually the Canal Zone basing. The Panama Canal Zone has extensive naval basing. If they poured even a quarter of the resources they put into here into Pearl Harbor at the same time, Pearl Harbor would not have been in the situation it was in 1941 when it was attacked. Because the Canal Zone has crucial importance to the US Navy, to the US security, and as such they pour a huge amount of funds and resources into securing it. The trouble is, when you consider the American Navy and its logistics, they are actually very much a regional force. They have global capabilities in terms of their carrier arm, their battleship fleet, their destroyers, their cruisers. They're all wonderfully long-range ships. But then look at the bases they can sustain themselves from and where they actually are. Look at their logistics hubs. Even if you're doing replenishment at sea, you do not want your ships sailing all the way across the Pacific to resupply and come back. That is incredibly inefficient. You're going to need a lot of supply ships for that. And especially you don't want to do it fast fleet oilers, which are far more expensive. What you want to do is have slow fleet ships, slow supply ships, or preferably civilian hulls you hire for the task, bring it to a theatre entry point, then naval slow ships, move it to the forward operating base, and from the forward operating base, fast fleet ships supply your battle fleet at where it's operating. That's how you want to run it. That's the economically sensible way. That's the sustainable methodology. But for that, you need bases. For that, you need a lot of bases. The Americans really don't have them. For that, you need a lot of ships, and the Americans, again, don't really have them. We often talk about the fast fleet oiler program in the US Navy. People forget the sheer quantity of Liberty ships and other vessels used as tankers to assist the US Navy in that, to take up the slow fleet role. You can't have the fast fleet oilers are the tip of a spear in sustainment terms. They are not the shaft, and they're not even the head of the spear. They're the tip of the spear. The head are the oilers which are moving it from the theatre entry point to the forward operating bases, and the shaft is everything that sustains and gets all the supplies to the theatre entry base. The theatre entry base is a critical point to pick. And this is something to think about, because really you want a base which is going to be far enough from the main action that you can expand your warehouses and stores over a wide area without worrying about the enemy coming up and blowing stuff up. But it also needs to be close enough that you are not going to be having to put too much pressure on your supply convoys going to your forward operating bases. It's a juggling act, and it's a constant thing you have to think about and think through. The really interesting thing about the American logistical process, though, is how overwhelming it becomes. And this is one of the reasons why, when it starts out like it does in 1939, it's such a transformation, because the Americans produce so much. They adopt a really different logistics process than anyone else, because for everyone else it's spare parts and things coming through. When the Americans, they are supplying so many aircraft forward that if you can't easily repair an aircraft off a carrier, you tip it over the side and you get a new one. Now that is both great logistically, but it's also wasteful. It's useful in terms of, and efficient in terms of, you don't have hangar queens sitting around, i.e. aircraft which are always maintenance problems and always causing trouble, so you basically are never able to use them. But it's problematic from the perspective of, think about all those resources which are wasted. Well, the Americans can afford to do that, and on the contingencies of World War II, it makes sense. Under the scenarios they're in, it makes sense. And they have built up to that. They have built up to this capability over time. But it's also, if we think about it, when people start discussing this in terms of modern operations and trying to base their ideas of it, you have to ask yourself, are you ever going to be in that scenario ever again? Is there ever going to be another war scenario where you are able to produce so much and supply so much forward that complex systems like aircraft are going to be logistically expendable for maintenance reasons? Think about that. It's not an aircraft you're losing through attrition of combat operations or through significant damage. You're losing an aircraft because it's easier to get a new aircraft than it is to fix it. Now, yes, you can put that down to combat losses, you can put that down to an accident maybe, but it's still a scenario whereby, where's your threshold going to be? Now, don't get me wrong, they still supply a huge amount of spare parts, and they do sustain and maintain a lot of aircraft. They do over-maintain aircraft just as much as the other better navies do in World War II when it comes to aviation operations at sea, because you have to over-maintain in a saltwater environment. Saltwater is the enemy. Saltwater is the greatest enemy. It corrodes everything, it will destroy everything, and it's one of the reasons why logistics at sea is quite so interesting, because you have to make sure things are not just waterproof, but saltwater-proof. And there is a difference, because if your seals are not saltwater-proof, the saltwater will corrode the seals. And once it's corroded the seals of whatever packing container the things are in, it will then corrode the things inside, which are supposed to be protected from the water. Yeah, saltwater. It's nasty. It is truly nasty. And then we have the British Empire. And please note, I'm not saying Britain, I'm saying the British Empire. And we're finishing on them because it's weird, but it also works. But it's different from everyone else's. So why is the British Empire weird? Why is the British Empire special? Well, the British Empire has to sustain armed forces globally. They really do. Look at all those bases. I mean, look at all those bases. Yes, the industrial and infrastructural hub of the UK and the Royal Navy is Britain itself. You can tell from the sheer amount of bases around Britain. But you can see there's quite a lot of bases around the world, and they vary at various points. Singapore is supposed to be the theatre entry base for Britain for any war in the Far East. Please note, theatre entry. Not the principal base of operations, not the forward operating base, the theatre entry base. And they have other theatre entry bases set up. If you consider Alexandria, Gibraltar, these are all those are set up as theatre entry bases and, to an extent, forward bases for any operations dealing with the Italians in the Mediterranean. But truly, they are theatre entry bases, and Malta is supposed to be the forward operating base for dealing with the Italians. They also have all the bases around the UK for dealing with the Germans, so they don't really need to worry about that. But again, Scapa Flow is sort of your forward operating base for protecting those areas, and then you have all the other bases around the UK are sort of theatre entry sustainment bases. But it's a very different scenario when you have such a huge infrastructure node as the UK as far as the Royal Navy is concerned. It's kind of like America's home bases. They technically could be classified as theatre entry bases or for their areas of operation, but it's a whole different level. And this is the point. This is what you're dealing with. But also, Britain has dominions as part of their empire, which are self-governing and have their own navies and their own navies, armies, air forces, and their own military-industrial systems, which are wedded in quite heavily into the British industrial system, but they exist. And so you have the facilities Australia maintains, you have the facilities New Zealand maintains, India maintains. This is an advantageous situation. It's a very different system than you have with the French. But you also have to coordinate all that. And you have to pay for it all to an extent, because let's be honest, most of those dominions do not have navies that require spaces to sustain aircraft carriers and capital ships. But the Royal Navy needs that. So you need to either persuade them to fund above the level they need to sustain themselves, or they need to believe that they need to fund above the level they need to sustain themselves because of the need for you to turn up, or you need to pay for it yourself, which causes all sorts of complications. But it also means that when you're looking at Britain from a basing perspective, Britain's looking around there at all these bases and going, well, we've got a lot of bases that we sustain and keep supplies flowing between by either merchant vessels, or if it's an active area, by maybe fleet auxiliaries or merchant ships. Ships taken up from trade and given some sort of naval fleet auxiliary crew, etc. They're sure they can do that. So what they're looking at permanently from those bases, sustaining fleets from them. That's a problem, though, for the British. Because to the extent the British grow very comfortable with that idea, they're very certain that Hong Kong and definitely Weihai Wei will fall in the opening stages of any war with Japan. Hong Kong might hold on for long enough, but they think it will fall. Their idea, though, is that Singapore, which has French Indochina and the American Philippines around it, as well as South China Sea, is far enough away, it should be able to definitely be fine until the main fleet turns up. And there's going to be a fleet come from the Mediterranean and a fleet come from home. And they're planning on sending pretty much the whole Royal Navy, because that's what they pretty much need to sustain operations against Japan. They want to maintain deterrence, enough force to support in the Mediterranean to support the French. If they are in a scenario where they're fighting the Italians, but they ideally would prefer not to have a war with the Italians at that time, because if you look at that whole strategic network, you'll notice that if you can use the Mediterranean as your supply route for the Far East, it's a lot easier, a lot quicker. You can move a lot more supplies with the same number of ships because the route is going to be a lot quicker. And that's it for most of the 1920s. But late in the 1930s, of course, Germany starts actually getting things like submarines, and the Scharnhorst class, and the Bismarcks are being built, and the Graf Zeppelin's being built, and suddenly you have to also worry about the Germans. And the trouble is, they are able to attack all this. And this is the problem. The Royal Navy, from the perspective of fighting Japan, the Far Eastern War, which had been a dominant risk for 1920s and 30s. And let's be honest, in January 1939, they are pointing guns at each other. The Japanese and the Royal Navy are pointing guns at each other in Tsingtao, or Monde Qingdo, over the SS St. Vincent de Paul. A British sort of flagged merchant vessel, which the Japanese customs had sort of impounded on the insistence of the army and had taken to a navy base, and the Royal Navy sent in a cruiser and a sloop to recover it, because you do not do that to a British flag merchant vessel. If you have a problem with a British flag merchant vessel under the rules of flagging, you are supposed to complain to the British, and the British will deal with it. That's why you have the flags you do. You don't impound it yourself. Especially not at gunpoint when it's in international waters. That's rude. The British had gone and collected it. The British withdrew it, and they did it under gunpoint with their own guns pointing at the Japanese. So for some reason, as far as the Royal Navy was concerned, there are the Germans who make loud, noisy, angry remarks, the Japanese who make loud, noisy, angry remarks, and also point guns at us. Which is the most likely threat for a war? It's the Japanese. But again, the British sustainment operations are, well, as far as they were concerned, for any war in the Far East, they can block the Japanese off at Singapore. The Japanese aren't going to get through the Panama Canal, so they need a force of the Falklands. They need probably a force on the Canadian coast, but the rest of the main force is going to be going up from Singapore. And with army units coming from Britain, from India, and Australia, New Zealand, they are planning on first retaking Hong Kong, if that had fallen, and then working their way up the coast, probably Weihai Wei, which is actually one of their traditional bases, but also taking Tsingtao itself, Qingdao, etc., and using those positions to sustain them for a war and operations against Japan. So they've structured their supplies and around that, and their facilities around that, and what they're building in terms of their auxiliaries. So if you think about that, where do you need the Royal Navy owned ships? Well, you need the Royal Navy owned ships after Singapore. You don't need them before that. You can hire merchant ships for that one. And Britain has the largest merchant fleet in the world at this point, so that makes perfect sense. Especially a huge number of tramp steamers, which are general purpose supply ships, which means they can move a huge amount of goods and supplies. They're a little bit shorter in refrigeration ships for their size, but they've got a fairly large amount of them as well, especially banana boats. And so that's the Navy's thinking. As things change, though, you have other problems. Britain's actually building fast oilers to make up for supporting the fleet and replenishing the fleet at sea, because they need to do more of that now, and because also their oilers which they had built for World War One and other periods were now not fast enough to be fast oilers anymore. That's another fun thing that happens when you hang around long enough and you have ships around for long enough. But the trouble is, Winston Churchill had some bright ideas. A lot of them get converted to amphibious warfare ships, carrying a whole load of landing craft, etc., landing craft gantry ships, which are able to deploy landing craft by gantries and have carry a lot of landing craft on the deck, and all those things is one of the favourite conversions of them. And that's it gives you an amphibious capability, and perhaps makes sense, arguably, if you're fighting in the UK waters, when you see you've got a huge number of bases and you're not going far enough away that you don't come home to refuel, or you can't be refueled by the fuel ships coming out. But problematic if you're operating in the Far East. Also, Britain develops a policy of, right, and if we need ships to shuttle quickly backwards and forwards between the Far East and home waters, what we need to have bases where we can have supplies of fuel stored, and they do build up huge fuel supplies at each of these bases. And what we'll have is a slow oilers which will just come out from that base, sit at sea. As the ships go past, they slow down to fill up from the oiler, and then the oiler goes back to its base, and so the ships don't actually need to pull into the base. But also, that oiler doesn't need to be that fast, because they're only slowing the ship down to that speed while it's filling up. They're not having to. They're not staying with the convoy. They're not staying with the fast movement of the groups. Again, this is a conceit based on the supply situation the British have built. They are not, in many ways, functioning in the worst case scenario of war versus Germany, Italy, and Japan at the same time. But honestly, for much of the 1920s and 30s, that seems like a remote possibility. War versus Italy and Japan, that seems like a possibility. But Italy, you can corner off in the Mediterranean and basically starve in the Mediterranean. And again, you're supposed to have the French on side, so yeah, you just need to provide enough forces to support the French so that they can overwhelm the Italians. That's the basic British policy. The French attack from the Western Mediterranean against the Italians, and the British from the Eastern Mediterranean against the Italians, and meet up in the middle, the Italian fleet preferably caught in the middle. And that's basically the plan, although the British are also quite happy to do a carrier attack on Taranto and damage the Italian fleet while it's in there. There are all sorts of fun plans for that scenario. But that doesn't really require the same amount of force as Japan does. Once you have Germany as well, that's a problem, because Germany is a threat to the home islands. This is always the scenario which causes the most problems for the British, because the moment you're affecting the home islands, and this is one of the reasons why in Napoleonic Wars, the first thing the British always do is blockade French ports, because once you've blockaded the French forts and the French fleet can't come out to invade the UK, you can then go and do the nasty operations you like to do to take their colonies around the world and basically embarrass them. Well, the thing is, you can only do that once the home fleet is secure. You secure the home by blockading the French ports or blockading in the Germans. They have direct access to you. That's always more of a problem. So that tends to override certain things. But as I said, the British had all sorts of plans for their logistics and were building up towards it. Their plan was to have the logistics ready by... It would have been ready by about mid to late 1941. Maybe early 1942. But they were building ships, they had them, they had more coming through, they were replacing and doing a generational upgrade. Something to think about, a time when British government were doing a generational upgrade of auxiliary ships. And sustaining them properly. Well, as much as they ever do, sustain them properly. But no, as you can see, they're all different. In the US case, honestly, their biggest problem is trying to get Congress to fund the tail. They're happy to fund the teeth, but they're really not happy to fund the tail, and they don't even really want to fund the teeth, if they're being honest, but they're always happier to fund that than the tail. With the French, it's trying to get them to decide on the strategy. When it comes to the Navy, it's the thing they debate and discuss and demur on most, is what they're actually going to do with it, and that affects their logistics. Affects where they're going to build up their sustainment to sustain from, and the logistics they're going to have. One of the interesting things is they do have a seaplane carrier ship, which is a very fast vessel and very capable for moving out to places and setting up a seaplane base, which is a very interesting idea and especially good for sustainment operations, because basically that is your mobile naval air patrol base, mobile maritime patrol facility, because you can move that to a bay or somewhere where you can easily defend that ship and set up a seaplane base, and then if you don't want it there because of the movement of enemy forces or because the theatres of operation have changed, you pack it up, move it on again. It's a useful asset to have. It's got strategic mobility. If not really, it's not really a tactical asset in and of itself. And the Soviets, as I said, they had... Their problems are mostly caused by the people in charge. gutting them. We have the Italians, who are focused on the Mediterranean, but honestly never really have the sustainment in place to sustain the operations which are possible by their fleet. And then we have the Germans, who have, well, they have ideas, but one of the interesting things is, have a look at Plan Z. They're talking about dry docks, they're talking about battleships, battle cruisers, panzer sheath, aircraft carriers. They're talking about all sorts of different things, but when you go for it, one of the things they really don't talk about is sustainable logistics for force projection. They just don't. And I would argue that's not because Raeder and Donitz are stupid and don't know what they're talking about. I'd argue it's because, in the political environment of Germany, they couldn't make the case for that until they had the assets already in service, and then put out, go, well, it'd be nice to do that with this, but we don't have the supply ship. And they are able to get some supply ships through, but they're very limited. They're mostly for the panzer sheath. So that's logistics in 1939. What they're looking at, what each nations are about. And again, they're all about their different plans, operations, and the way they're planning on their geostrategic positions. And when we talk about geostrategic positions, we're talking about not just where the nation is in the world and where it wants to be. We're talking about where does it draw resources from? Where does it sell to? What's the markets it's got to buy from? What's the markets it's got to sell to sustain itself? What it is, everything. And that will affect their plans of operations. See, for the British, a war against Japan could have been, just Japan, could have been sustained almost indefinitely. Because British trade, if it's flowing America, doesn't cross the Pacific. You know, as long as they can control Singapore and push the Japanese back from that as their theatre entry point, all their trade can carry on as normal. They lose out on the China markets. That's not a big loss for the British economy. That's really not a massive problem. They can do all the South American stuff, they can do all the African stuff, they can do all the North American stuff, all the European, all those things. So economically, that's actually the best war for the British to end up in, because it doesn't affect them economically a jot. It's similar for the Americans. War versus Japan. For Japan, it's economically devastating because they lose access to all their markets immediately. But for them, it's sustainable. Now, there is a reason I'm now talking about Japan, because hopefully, if it's worked, Japan is the last nation we'll be talking about. Japan's issue was always not that they didn't have the technology to do decent construction or build the complicated and interesting components, is that they didn't have enough technology, didn't have enough space to do it, and they didn't have enough raw materials, especially not of the quality they needed. One of the reasons why their steel manufacturing, especially their sword construction, gets as good as it is, because the quality of iron, the quality of minerals they have access to. So they have to be good. It's one of those weird things, but it's always true. People tend to become the highest quality when they are faced with adversity. When you've got the poorest quality materials to work with, you have to have the highest standards to achieve what you want to achieve. Whereas when you've got access to very good quality materials, you are sort of swamped by abundance, and you can, in some ways, be less good. Although, in other ways, you then also get the development of artisans who are just trying to pursue it to make it the best it possibly can be out of pure passion for it. Which then creates a whole different thing. It's a whole discussion, that is. But Japan's situation is always they're dealing with the resources and materials they have. They're dealing with the reality of the situation they face. And so, for them, their plans for war and their doctrine around war is often around having the enemy. They are going to be cut off. They know if any war which they are actually going to be hard pressed is going to be against Britain or America, both of which can cut them off from their outside world resources. And the odds are they know they'll probably end up fighting both, because they know, just as well as Britain and America do, that if one of them humbles Japan solo, that will undermine the other's strategic position in the Far East, in the Pacific area, in Asia. So neither Britain nor America can afford to have the other one win a war against Japan solo. They have to get involved. So Japan knows they're probably going to end up fighting both. And their scenario that they want to do is basically draw them in, whittle them down, and then destroy them, and then negotiate. That's their idea. Negotiate from a position of strength. They think if they've won a major battle, if they've cost them enough resources, they can win. That they can have a negotiated peace and come out stronger. That's their only hope. There's really not much of a hope with that, because both Britain and America have a tendency of, oh, we've lost a fleet. Build a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one, and a fifth one, and a sixth one. So we've won. Oh, good. How many fleets are we using now? Just the first three. Okay, is the fourth one almost finished? Yeah. Cancel fifth and sixth fleets. And seventh. And will you ordering the eighth as well? Oh, dang. That's the sort of scenario you're dealing with when you're dealing with the British Empire and America. They just keep building until they win. Why would they do anything else? So Japan realizes they have to concentrate their logistics and be able to sustain themselves, ideally from the home islands. But they can't. So that's one of the reasons why they look at the northern resource area and the southern resource area. Why are they looking at them? Because they need the resources. They need the raw materials. The trouble is, they don't really have the budget to look into enough of what moving those resources around is going to be like. They don't really have the force sustainment that's needed to make those scenarios work for them. Especially not the southern resource area. Possibly the northern resource area, which they could maybe funnel through Korea and other areas to get the resources closer to Japan, so they had less worry about sea sustainment. They could possibly do that, but also, let's be honest, northern resource area, the British nor the Americans would get involved if they were seriously likely to win there, because that's going to take it off the Soviet Union. And Britain and America aren't going to worry about that. Southern resource area, whatever happens going after that, is going to cause trouble with Britain and America. It just is. Too many allies, too much opportunity. And the Philippines and Singapore, for starters. And the fact that Britain's defending Australia, sort of informally responsible for the defence of the Dutch East Indies. To an extent, the British look at the Dutch and go, yeah, there's an Anglo-Dutch company responsible for the extraction of petroleum there, so yeah, we'll also look after that. These things have a habit of working out. But Japan still has the idea of what logistically they need to do. And they do stockpile, they do have resources stockpiled. That's one of the reasons why they do sustain themselves as well they do through World War II. There is the fact that you can look at pictures of this naval arsenal, of this naval yard, of this facility in 1945 and find it stuffed full of midget submarines. Literally. There's a picture you can find quite easily of the dry dock full of submarines. And we're not talking a dozen submarines. We are talking 80+ submarines. That's a lot of subs. A lot of midget subs. The Japanese have resources, but they're very bad at moving resources around. And this is because in 1939, and even before that and after that, they are having the problem of teeth versus tail sustainment and investment. You see, they can't really build enough teeth for what they want to do. And the Yamatos not only undermine their carrier building program and their cruiser building program, but also they undermine, to an extent, their merchant shipbuilding program. And that means that, especially while they're building prestige merchant vessels like liners and some very nice cargo ships, they don't really think about supply ships. They have some, but they're not a major asset. And that's a problem when your primary theatre of operations is the Pacific, because whilst there are islands, etc., you need to sustain those islands. And if you want to use those islands to sustain the fleets, you need to have supplies on those islands to sustain the fleet. And it's better to sustain the fleets at sea, which means the Japanese are always facing a shortage of sustainment vessels. But ultimately, again, that's because, in part, their doctrine calls for the enemy to be getting closer and closer to Japan as they're attacking them. They're whittling the enemy down as they approach Japan, and once they get to Japan, quite close to Japan, that's when they have the major fleet engagement. So if you think about it, what are your supply requirements for that kind of operation? If your forces are getting closer and closer to Japan, you're making the jobs easier and easier to sustain from the Japanese bases. Maybe not visiting directly, but how quickly is it going to be for your limited supply ships to return, resupply, and get back to the fleet? The quicker, closer and closer the forces are getting to Japan. So Japan's logistical challenge is in many ways undermined by their own concept of operations. But, and I say this with all heart, it also fails to grasp some of the realities of the conflict they are going to be engaged in. There is an emphasis on what they can achieve, not what they can sustain. And you can see that by how fast they expand their empire and territory. And basically they cause their own collapse because they can't sustain it. There are points in the war where they start dropping back from places and actually giving up territory because they realize they just can't sustain it, so they evacuate and move back to places where they can sustain. And that's a problem, because their whole reason for securing that territory in the first place had been to give them strategic depth and secure access to resources, as well as security for their resources, to be able to accessible and supply themselves. So if you start having to give up territory because you can't sustain it, you can no longer protect, you no longer necessarily have access to resources you wanted to have access to, and you no longer can protect the access to those resources and the movement of those resources. Realistically, Japan is probably the country which is in the most problems logistically, because they have the most challenging defensive and operational doctrinal scenario to face, and strategic scenario to face. And yet, they've also designed a system which makes them think that the logistical challenge will be easy. Furthermore, you have the fact that certain personnel in this, even Yamato, on logistics, are to an extent ignored when they are making the case for construction. When he is within the Ministry of the Navy and is trying to make the case for more supply ships, he really has trouble, because the argument is, no, it's better to spend money on destroyers. Well, yes, destroyers are more lethal. They fight more. But destroyers with no supplies are not that useful. Again, I refer you to the earlier assessment of tanks without lorries. You need the supply ships. You need the sustainment. So, with all that discussion of logistics and the realities faced in 1939 and their systems, let's consider today's question. I want you to pick a power not discussed today. I.e., one of the minor nations. I want you to think about what kind of fleet they really need to secure their interests. And then I want you to think about what's the realistic logistic needs they need to sustain that. And logistical needs can be many things. You know, the British have the mobile naval basing system. Why? So they can set up bases and secure them. They are a combination of Royal Marine troops to secure bases and various logistics and maintenance personnel so they can set up a base facility. That's the initial British deployment to Crete. That would have been probably quite successful and sustainable on its own, and if they just added on to that and left a Royal Marine Major General in charge, it could well have been a very different situation in Crete. But no, again, various people decided it should be an Army General in charge because they know more about fighting. It's defending an island. Honestly, the Royal Marines, who had been practicing and working out how to defend naval bases which were going to be secured as islands for the previous 20 years, were probably a fairly good option, but yeah. So, I want you to think through the logistical requirements. How you're setting this up. CBs, MONABs, whatever. How are you going to, what you're going to do to sustain? How are you going to, what kind of ratio you think you need? Do you need to have government-owned mercantile vessels to do the strategic run, or are you going to need? Are you only needing theatre entry stuff because you're going to be fighting primarily in your own theatre? So you need ships which are naval ships to move between supplies between bases because they've got to be armed and designed to basically defend themselves, along with as part of a convoy. And only need a couple of fast fleet oilers to sustain vessels which are out at sea, but they're not going to be operating far away from you. I want you to think about all this. And all the things that have been discussed today in today's discussion. And I'd like to see what you say. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Right then, so again, this is the year of the aircraft carrier, and next week is going to be Melbourne and Bonaventure, which I actually haven't recorded yet, so hopefully I get that recorded before the movers arrive. Life is fun. Thank you very much for watching, hope you enjoyed, and thank you again for all your support and kindness. Take care and have a nice evening.